Welcome to this week's episode of the Precinct Omega podcast. My name is Roby Jenkins, and this is another in my fortnightly design series where I'm fortunate enough to have been joined by somebody else who I'm going to hope to persuade to do most of the talking. I've had a few fantastic guests over the last few months, and this week I'm particularly excited to have on board one of the big inspirations behind my decision to get into writing my own miniatures games, and that is Ivan, possibly Ivan Sorensen of Nordic Weasel. Hello, Ivan.
Hey, man. How you doing?
Welcome to the show. Thank you ever so much for giving me some of your time to talk about your past, present, and future in miniatures wargames design.
Absolutely.
So the obvious first place to go is naturally going to be, how did you get started writing miniatures wargames? We had a brief conversation before I started recording, and I know that, like me, you're not somebody who's come into this from an obvious path. But what has been your path? What has your life taken you down that's brought you to writing miniatures games for fun and profit?
Yeah, I think to an extent, I think this is the case for a lot of people who write, that there's just like an built-in urge to like tinker with rules and like see what happens. It's like, you know, in the old days you had kids who took apart like their dad's radio to see what was inside. I think it's the same sort of drive. I remember being a kid and like always trying to like write my own little board games and stuff. What got me into miniature specifically was like 10,000% of gaming youth, probably Warhammer 40k, back in the second edition days, and then Warzone from the Mutant Chronicles minis game back then.
Which is when, now correct me if I'm wrong, so you're originally from Denmark?
Yeah.
And Mutant Chronicles was a Scandinavian property, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a Swedish game from Target Games, which is kind of like the Swedish counterparts of like TSR or something. Like, they were huge until they weren't huge anymore. That's how these things go.
So Warzone did have an impact in the UK back in those days, but it really was pretty negligible compared to 40k. Was it really quite a present thing in the miniatures wargaming world in Scandinavia?
So where in the like mid 90s era, when internet stuff wasn't nearly as accessible, I think a lot of it just depended on like the store you happen to like live by. So in the town I grew up in, the local gaming store, which was pretty well stocked, they were big into Warzone. They were really pushing it as an alternative to 40k, and for a hot minute it looked like it was going to be, and then it wasn't anymore. And now the license has been lingering. But that was kind of like, I think everyone has like, you have the game you start on, which is, you know, 40k for a lot of people, and then you have the game that kind of like opens your eyes, like, oh, there's more stuff out there, there's more ways to do this. And Warzone was very much kind of that for me. And then not that long after that, I started getting into like historical gaming, driven by an interest in World War One. And then from there, once we had access to the internet, it was just everything I could get my hands on. It was tricky in those days because you couldn't go, you know, like you were limited to whatever your local store could actually order. So I remember like going on the internet and finding like lists of games that people talked about. And then I would go down to the store and try to order them. They would look at the list like, we can't order that. Our distributor don't carry it.
That's been out of print for 20 years. Where have you heard that name?
I know. Well, that was the issue too, you know, because a lot of that stuff was stuff that had been floating around. You know, I was born in 1980, so some of that stuff had been floating around since before I was even born. But yeah, pretty much as soon as, you know, I got into miniatures, I started tinkering, like, you know, like everyone creates their own units or their own like ridiculously broken characters for Warhammer and stuff like that. And then from there, just experiment with like little crabby, janky games that, you know, I exposed my friends to, and eventually some of them end up being kind of fun. The actual start to writing was a game called Fast and Dirty, which you still see like people mention online occasionally, even though I haven't been involved with it for like probably 20 years, actually.
Wow.
15 years at least. It was, it had the fortune of bebeing well suited to 15mm sci-fi at the time, and it was one of the few kind of big generic games. It was very much intended to be like StarCraft 2, but a little smoother. So for a while, it was sort of an unofficial, like on the miniatures page and stuff like that. It was kind of a like what grunts became for 15mm sci-fi, where it was sort of the norm for a while. So that was kind of the start, and that was really the like, oh shit, like I've written something and people like actually enjoy it, and now there's people wanting more stuff or wanting different stuff or complaining about rules, and now you got to deal with all that. So that was kind of the start of it. And then from there, it was just tinkering throughout the years. Back in 2000, I want to say 14. I was working at a really terrible job in an office I hated, doing a job I hated with a bunch of people that I only hated half of.
And you're in the States. You'd moved to the States by that point.
Yeah, this was stateside.
And I think that's important to know because people don't imagine that there are bad jobs in Denmark.
They're boring jobs in Denmark, but this was a customer service call center, and
right.
So it was like the most soulless thing possible, and I was middle management, which is
even more soulless. I mean, at least you weren't settling insurance claims, but that's
it was dreadful. And at some point, we were in a position where like we could get by, me and my wife, for like a little bit of time if I didn't bring in that much money. So I was like, okay, I calculated out. I bet I could make at least a bit of money selling stuff and writing. So I quit and threw myself at it, and then from there, it just kind of became history, I guess.
And you have been prolific since then. I only actually have ever bought and played one of your games, which is the third edition 5 Parsecs from Home. But I had a good look at your the Nordic Weasel catalogue on Wargame Vault, and there is a lot of stuff there.
There's a few. So one of the benefits, because people ask about it, is that it is an unfair advantage because writing is what I do, for a living. Like this is my primary job and primary way of making an income. So it's a little bit of an advantage compared to a lot of folks who are doing it, as a side gig. If you're writing for an hour every night, 4 nights a week, there's a limit to how much you could do as opposed to sitting at the keyboard for 12 hours and, banging something out. But part of it too is, and I think I don't want to polish my feather too much, but I think one of the things that maybe does set me apart is that my interests, both thematically and mechanically, are just really wide.
Yeah.
I tend to get bored doing the same thing. This is the same reason that I've created a lot of systems and game engines, that after a while I just get bored with the same thing. It's the same way of doing things. You can take a game engine or take a project and get 2 or 3 variations out of it, and then I want to do something else. I want to do something that's more interesting or capture some other fragment.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm at the place now with Horizon Wars where I'm 2 games in to Horizon. Well, I suppose 3 games into Horizon Wars, and that's all I plan to do with it. But people do occasionally say, "Oh, why don't you do a version of Horizon Wars that does this or that does that?" I'm like, well, there's only so much you can squeeze out of a system.
Right.
I think you're really
and it can get kind of forced at a point. Sorry, it can get kind of forced at a point too. Can you do starship battles with Horizon Wars? Well, maybe you could, but
just have.
Oh, well, there you go. So it depends a lot too on how abstract or how specific the engine is. From what I remember of Horizon Wars, and I regret to say I haven't had a chance to play. I've just read. If the starting point is has a certain level of abstraction in it, it's a lot easier to modify it into to other things. The more specific you get.
No, absolutely, it is. And I mean, you've really gone much wider than I have. So you've got historical games, you've got World War II, World War I games, you've got fantasy, post-apocalyptic, science fiction. In terms of setting, you've gone very broad. Now, obviously, I think it's fair to say that you're best known for the 5X from Y series, as it seems to be known.
The naming convention is almost like a story in itself.
Would you like to tell us that?
Yeah, sure, because it comes up a lot and people get confused about it. And in hindsight, so I have absolutely like no talent in marketing. So in hindsight, like make sure your names are like easily recognizable and easy to differentiate. The first, actually the second commercial game I did, but the first under the Nordic Weasel like branding was 5 Men in Normandy, which was a little World War II skirmish game, obviously, and it was called that because there's a tendency for players always to like play bigger games than quote you're supposed to with the rule set. So I wanted to put it in the title that you're only supposed to use 5 dudes, hence the name, and it's Normandy, so it would be clear what you're doing, right? So it's a patrol game in World War II. Then after a while, people wanted a sort of generic version of it that wasn't World War II specific, which became 5 core. 5 because it was still 5 dudes, and core because it was the core mechanics. And the original 5 Parsecs was actually a supplement for that, which still had, it had all the campaign stuff, but it was a lot more rough around the edges and a different game engine.
So going back to the beginning, was 5 Men in Normandy, that was a solo game as well, was it?
Solo, like, friendly. At the time, solo gaming wasn't as, like, established a thing as it is now, so it was a little more. I had played a lot of Nuts from 2 Hour Wargames, which has a heavy solo focus. And I wanted to kind of capture some of that, but, with a different take on the mechanics, a different take on, like, the flow of the game. But yeah, so being solo friendly was definitely, and the campaign kind of assumes that you're playing on your own, but it wasn't set up strictly to be that. So down the road, I realized that the game engine for kind of sprawling, colorful sci-fi ran into some issues, and it was a little more abstract than I think was good for attracting new players. Plus, it was split over 2 books, which made it kind of awkward and unwieldy. So I redid the whole game, which became 5 Parsecs from Home, 2nd edition, with what was the nucleus of like the current game system. And then from there, the spin-offs have all been like 5 distance units from location in the naming convention.
So we've got now 5 Parsecs from Home, of course, which is in its 3rd edition now via Modifius Entertainment. We've got 5 Leagues from the Borderlands, which is just been announced. Is this going to be a 2nd edition?
This is technically also 3rd edition.
3rd edition, 5 Leagues from the Borderlands. Also just been announced, Modifius are releasing that.
Yes, so, probably end of the year. Depends on layout and,
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I've seen the sort of the mock-up of the front cover. It looks fantastic. Then there's 5 Clicks from the Zone, is that right?
Yeah, which is kind of a take on the Swedish Mutant role-playing game.
Oh, okay.
It's still a miniatures game, but inspired by kind of like a Swedish counterpart of like Gamma World or something.
Yeah, it's a post-apocalyptic, irradiated wasteland kind of setting. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like pick your own apocalypse, but now there's mutants and people shoot at each other.
Right. Okay.
I
was going to say, what other 5X from Y games are currently?
The last that exists now is a beta version called 5 Kilometers from Leipzig, which is for black powder, which I keep meaning to build out. The problem is that doing generic black powder, you have to like find a way of like hooking, something interesting to it. So it may be once I sit down to actually do it, it'll be like American Civil War, like campaigns, or like everyone does Sharp for Napoleonics. I kind of want to do something that isn't specifically that.
Well, we got Joe McCulloch, of course, coming now with his Silver Bayonet fantasy horror Napoleonic, which will be interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of. So that's one of the things that you always run into, and I ran into this constantly with both 5 Leagues and 5 Parsecs. There's a distinction between like what would be cool to put in the book and what can you like go buy miniatures for. And with 5 Parsecs, there were a couple of moments where like this is specifically here for people to like convert minis, because there just wasn't anything suitable on the market. But you can't like make it too out there because then like nobody can play the game, right?
But now, of course, the market for miniatures is so diverse. I mean, it's hard to believe that there isn't a miniature for anything out there. And even if there is, you've always got something like Hero Forge you can go to, and you can make up pretty much anything you can imagine.
Yeah, it is kind of a golden age in that sense. The other day we were talking about, because one of the player races in the 5 Leagues, like glossy Modifius version, are basically like bird people. And I was saying, like, yeah, you probably have to like do a conversion for these and get handy with some green stuff. And then people found like 10 different ranges of bird people that are already out there, you know?
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's definitely but it is kind of when you're writing for stuff, that people have to supply their miniatures for, and you'll know this as well. You kind of have to like have an eye on like what's realistically possible for people to like go get.
It's also, I mean, my brain is also generally, I mean, I very much sort of tried to pitch the idea of playing games with miniatures you already own.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And although it is, it is lovely to give people inspiration to go out and buy stuff, especially from the small independent manufacturers. Always a fan of that. On the other hand, we all own dozens, hundreds, thousands sometimes of miniatures, and it's so easy just to, for people to talk about just going out and dropping another £300 on a new army for some other game. And I'm like, just use the miniatures you already have, for heaven's sake. Just find something new and different and exciting to do with them.
Although people are also sometimes just looking for an excuse to go out and drop that £300 on a new army.
I get that. But there are probably boxes gathering dust somewhere in that pile. I mean, I know I have boxes and boxes of half painted minis. I just need the motivation to get them sorted out.
That's actually kind of part of the why. There's 2 reasons I tend to focus on skirmish games a lot. Not exclusively, but for the most part. One is just personal preference. I always find it more interesting when what you see on the table is reasonably 1-to-1 scale. But the second is, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years, is the barrier of entry to begin wargaming and miniatures gaming. Because one of the things that started popping up a lot when we announced the glossy version of 5 Parsecs was all these people who weren't minis gamers. They're role players or board gamers or other people. And a lot of them, they were aware of minis gaming. They had seen it. But to them, minis gaming meant digesting like a 600-page Warhammer book and then, spending $40K worth of miniatures.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to happen. If I'm coming from role-playing games, I can pick up a copy of like Savage Worlds for $10. I'm willing to throw $50 down to get into some sort of game I experience. But I'm not going to burn $400 if I don't know if I'll enjoy it.
Right.
So being able to say, okay, if you can gather up like 6 characters you like the look of, and you can gather up, 20-ish bad guys, and you don't mind proxying them a little bit, you can start playing. You just need this book, and I think that's really important. I think that's why the warband style of games have for a while it seemed like every month somebody was announcing a new warband game.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have kind of come and gone. And I don't know if people are starting to look for the next whatever is the next hot potato, but I think that was a big impetus at the time. People were like, I can start this game even if I have to buy new minis for it, or I want to buy new minis. I could buy 8. And I can actually play a meaningful game. I remember being really demoralized way back in the day as a kid, looking at Warhammer Fantasy Battle and saying, "Oh yeah, you could buy a box of elves and you can play this game." Except you can't because you need 200 more of the bastards.
Yeah. But I suppose actually 5 Parsecs is a really good gateway game for people coming from role playing. Not only because of the low count of miniatures, but even from the process of putting your party together is very reminiscent of assembling a character for a role play game.
Absolutely.
A combination of pick tables and rolling dice and ascribing points and finding out backstories and putting the narrative together. I mean, it's so literally, because I've just put a party together for 5 Parsecs. The other weekend, I was out playing a one-shot D&D campaign, and the 2 experiences are incredibly similar. So it would be a much easier step into miniatures gaming to come into something like 5 Parsecs than really, I think, any other miniatures game that I've come across, and I put my hands up for Horizon Wars on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very intentional. I've always been like fascinated by the sort of gray area between RPGs and miniatures games. Because to me, and maybe it was just the group I grew up kind of, coming of age playing games with. But we never really had that much distinction between different kinds of games. Like we played RPGs, we played miniatures, we played board games, we played cards. If it was a game and it had like swords and elves, we wanted to play it. That was it. So the idea that these were like very distinct hobbies always seemed kind of like abstract. Like I remember being surprised getting older and talking to people who grew up and they just played RPGs. They had never played Magic. They had never played, whatever, Warhammer. And I thought it was so strange. And now I realize that's the norm because, people have a limited amount of money and time and motivation.
That's right.
But to me, it was always like they were always much closer in my mind. And that's some of the stuff I wanted to do. I've talked about it before, I think, on the blog. That I think the distinction between Parsecs and Leagues versus some of the other games, Rangers is the one that always gets compared because Leagues and Rangers are conceptually very similar.
Yeah.
I think the difference to me is that the stuff I write is still at its core a miniatures game, but it's wrapped with like RPG elements around it. Like the core of it is still setting up a tabletop battle and slugging it out. And once you get to the rules portion, it's wargamer stuff. It's cut down because it's a solo game, but it's very clearly like a minis game. Whereas I think with a lot of stuff and Rangers, I feel when I play Rangers, it always feels like I'm playing through somebody's D&D campaign. It's very like driven at a particular experience, and that's not a good or bad thing. It's just kind of what it is.
Yeah, it's just a different feel to the game. I mean, it does also address the question of how it is that Modiphius, who published the deluxe edition of Rangers of Shadowdeep, are now publishing a new fantasy-themed solo miniatures game. And you go, whoa, that's an interesting decision. But when you talk about that distinction in feel, it suddenly makes more sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think they complement each other like quite well, in my opinion. But I think there's also a lot of people who are, like people just want different things. So you played something that's heavily scenario-driven, is a very specific kind of story. And I think a lot of those people are primed and like, okay, we've had that experience. Let's have something that's more, procedurally generated, more unpredictable, and it's more kind of your story that unfolds. When you're rolling through stuff, there's always that feeling that the exact combination of things you just got, statistically, probably nobody else had that. And sometimes it doesn't matter that much. Like you and me both fought some space pirates, but mine were led by robots. So, but like that's all.
The party was completely different to mine, with different backstories and different motivations, and so different narrative responses to the events that turned out in the game. It's always that. Yeah. There's so many variables coming together in 5 parsecs that you're right. I mean, it's statistically improbable that 2 players would ever play even a similar campaign, let alone an identical one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things on the Discord whenever people are posting, like, oh, I just had my first game and I got trashed. And people are asking, like, oh, which enemies? And, like, it's pretty rare because people start guessing because everyone has, like, the first tough enemy they fought and got trashed by it. But, So, yeah, it's an interesting... I think it just is a very different kind of experience. And I think there's definitely like room for that. I think also, and I'm going to polish my feather a little bit here, a lot of games that rely on random tables do it kind of poorly. I think there's a tendency, and RPG guys are really bad about this. I think I've lost track of how much stuff I bought on like drive-thru, which is like D100 random door fixings in dungeons or something. Like nobody cares about that. Like what it should be is if you're making a random door table for some ungodly reason, is what does this door mean for like the scenario you're playing out? Are there traps that summon more monsters? Is it connected to something? Is it a teleporter? Is it something that's actually interesting and like adds to the game as opposed
the classic question is this a door I can break down?
Right, exactly. Like otherwise
it's not even locked. Yes, but could I break it down if it was?
But yeah, so I think a lot of I think random tables can sometimes be, I don't want to say misused, but like used poorly because it just generates like random guff.
I consider it to be the lazy option. I'll be honest,
Yeah,
generally speaking. And I'm guilty of using random tables myself as well, but I always think it
oh,
should be the
absolutely.
last resort if you
Hmm.
can't think of any other way to generate a satisfying outcome.
Hmm.
The table is the last resort of choice.
Yeah. And it's also one of those things, and it's funny because people get very like tied to like the written word. So, and maybe it's just not as explicit as it ought to have been, but it's always been like assumed, in both leagues and parsecs that as you're rolling through stuff and you're rolling on an encounter, you might suddenly get the idea like, oh, for this encounter, it would make perfect sense if the enemy like came on from the flank and then this guy was here. And it was always kind of assumed, you just interrupt the process and have that happen. But a lot of people get very like tied to exactly as it's written, and
I've had exactly the same experience with Zero Dark that people get very fixated upon following precisely the instructions as written in the game, and I'm like,
yeah,
no,
yeah.
if it makes more sense for that enemy model to move in that direction, just move them in that direction. It's a solo game. You can't cheat at it.
Yeah, we ended up actually, as I think you mentioned in your review, we ended up adding kind of the official cheat option, which is story points, as
Oh
a
yeah,
way of getting people in that direction, saying, okay, like if you want rules for cheating, here's the rules for cheating. You get to do it like 8 times, and here's kind of how it works. Now, um, one of the things I did focus on, this was a design goal from the beginning of 5 parsecs when it became its own system, was that it is possible to play it, quote, out of the box. Like if you want to do nothing else but just follow the book page by page and roll in the tables, you will have a scenario and campaign, and you didn't have to make any choices to get there. But it was just never meant to be the end point.
Now, we're about halfway into or half an hour into our conversation.
Mhm.
So, just to sort of bring an end to this part, you did mention in the past that you have a blog. Where could people find your blog?
The blog is 5 Minute Normandy on Blogspot. If you Google for it there, or on Blogger, sorry.
So you're still
Although it has
running
been updated a little
the
bit
same
because with
blogspot
new
blog that
warlords,
you
there's
started for 5 Men in Normandy.
yeah. So still have my own blog, and it's kind of a mixture of musings on design questions, musings on industry, and just general talk about stuff I'm working on.
Because that's kind of where I wanted to move the conversation up. I've got one more question before I move on to the sort of the what I hope will be the meat of this conversation. One of the
Absolutely.
things that I did take a shot at 5 parsecs over was the absence of photography. And I know you came back to me very nicely later and said that you thought that there had been a plan for there to be miniatures
Yes.
photography, but somehow it just kind of got forgotten in the mix of things. Will we see photography in 5 Leagues from the Borderlands?
Uh, so yes, just to fill like listeners in, the assumption from the early conversation with Parsecs had always kind of been that we would gather up miniatures, photography, and showcase, and then along the way, it just kind of got forgotten. I think personally, I got so excited about having like a bunch of like glossy artwork that it just kind of slipped. For leaks, it I'll have to double check, so I'm not saying something that is got to end up not being correct. I think there is a plan of having both, but don't hold me to that.
I
But
hope
if
so. I
there
hope
is,
so. Just because, as you know, I mean, I know that technically Modiphius does have its own miniatures ranges, but most of them are some kind of licensed miniatures. So I love the
yeah,
opportunity of games like ours to showcase the work of independent miniatures manufacturers that, frankly, desperately
oh
need
yeah,
showcasing sometimes. So I love to see that opportunity taken when it's there. So
yeah,
I'd love to move on now and kind of move almost more to the content of your blog,
yeah,
because
sure.
as somebody who has written so prolifically in miniatures game design with multiple different mechanical approaches,
Hmm.
how do you go about getting started when you've got an idea for a new miniatures game? What does that idea look like, and how do you begin taking it forwards?
Yeah, a lot of times. So there's a couple of ways it can start, I think, and it just depends on the project a little bit. The most common for me is honestly some sort of mechanic that comes into my head, a dice mechanic, or a way to resolve something that I think is kind of neat or has some sort of scope. Like for the original five core, it literally started with the idea of what if there were no modifiers and you could just look for ones and sixes on the dice, and then it kind of grew from there. Sometimes you'll find, so I'll start like fleshing it out, like, okay, if we take this mechanic and that's a core of how things work, it can be a turn sequence or a combat mechanic, and then you bolt on some move and you bolt on some other things, and a lot of times you'll realize partway through that this isn't actually like all that much fun, or there's nothing to set it aside from like the billion other games out there. uh, and it just ends up in the dustbin. And sometimes, it has enough legs, or you realize that this works, but for a fairly specific and limited thing. So that means the game has to be about this. Um, so I would say at least like half the time, it starts from a mechanical perspective of just um, game mechanics in the abstract, and then at some point it becomes clear like what this will work for. Like this mechanic would work really well for a melee centered game, so it becomes a fantasy thing or whatever. Sometimes it's a just a project idea that I'm really interested in. I have a holy grail out there for doing a series of World War One stuff that I want to do, and for that, the mechanics that fit the setting or the period is good.
It is a remarkably untapped resource, World War One, for miniatures war games. It's often asked why are there so few World War One themed mini war games?
Yeah, a lot of it is that we're still kind of shaking off the sort of like public perception that's been hanging out for like 50 years of,
Yeah,
like it's all like men walking slowly into machine gun fire and nothing happened for 4 years and then suddenly it was over.
exactly.
Uh,
Whereas anybody who studies the history of it knows how much diversity and new technology and new tactics and new environments were being explored at the time, and lots
oh,
of skirmish
absolutely.
potential, masses of skirmish potential.
Yeah, one of the things actually is I think it would be extremely well suited to solo gaming, exactly because it allows you to get started without having to chase down some other dude to start. So that's one of my like holy grail projects out there.
Hmm.
So sometimes it's a setting or a specific thing. Sometimes it is honestly out of spite a little bit to prove people wrong. When, I have a Cold War game called No End in Sight, which is a very sort of gritty tactical military thing.
Yeah.
And that honestly came out of a people online telling me that you couldn't have a game where the chance of hitting your target was low because it would be boring, and that you couldn't have a game where you had to deal with wounded soldiers because it would be too dreary. And
Oh,
I was like, no, I bet I can do those, and it'll be interesting.
absolutely.
Um, or probably the moment of me being most coy was writing Renegade Scout, which was a rogue trader retro clone.
Yes.
Because I kept seeing projects of people getting together online saying we should do a retro clone, a rogue trader, it would be awesome. And then 17 pages of or forum posts later, and it had all gone away because that's
Yeah.
how every group project went. And I was like, you know what? I bet I could do it. And then, I did. And it was even kind of good. But so sometimes it's honestly just, I get a hair up my ass and about something that I bet it can be done, and I want to show that it can be done. Uh, but most of the time, it's a little less belligerent. It's just, like I said, a mechanical starting point, something that's conceptually interesting. I love game mechanics. I love seeing how, sometimes it's almost like a challenge. I've written a couple of games where, like, 5 parsecs combat is incredibly basic and mundane, and that was kind of
Mm.
on purpose,
Mm.
both for the solo purpose, but also because I wanted to see if you could make an interesting game that folded around like a really pedestrian combat resolution.
Mm.
Like everyone has played a game before, like if you where you roll at some stuff versus the target number or an opposed roll, right?
Yep.
Like there's nothing exciting about those. So the mechanically exciting thing is more like the initiative system or things like that.
And the narrative. I mean, and one thing, I'm always quick to have a go at games that do have dull mechanics, but that's not
Mhm.
anything that and I had some things to say about 5 parsecs, but that was never on my list of
Mhm.
complaints because I never saw that as being core to the 5 parsecs experience.
Yeah.
The resolution could almost have been anything, and it wouldn't really have mattered because the experience is the narrative, is the immersion in the experience of your crew and their enemies and their story. How you
Yeah,
resolve things is almost irrelevant.
right, and that's part of why, because people who play, if you read like blogs and stuff, like most of the time people say like, oh, they're kind of surprised, especially the first couple of times, like, oh, I set up the game and like I played through it, and it almost took as long to like set up the terrain as it did to like resolve the battle, and that's because the battle is just part of it. Like the game is the campaign, it's
Yeah.
seeing what you did, it's sending your dudes out to like go trading in town and get drunk, and then it's like shooting at the other dudes with lasers. Like
Yeah.
none of them are. Yeah, it's absolutely intended to be played as a campaign, and that's why each component is kind of short in that sense.
Hmm. Have you got a? Tell you what, no, for me as a designer to ask you this question would be unfair. Actually, I was going to ask you if you've got a mechanic that you're dying to use but haven't got around to yet. And I think before I can ask you that, I have to put one of my own on the table.
That's fair. That's fair.
I would love to write a game built around poker mechanics.
Okay.
Where you play with a deck of cards and each player has a hand of cards and you have to make poker hands in order to complete actions, and your opponent will bid against your hand in an attempt to defeat you before you reveal what your hand actually is.
It would be so tempting to make that a Wild West game.
Exactly. But I've tried. I've been working on this concept for best part of 10 years, and I've not yet made it work to my satisfaction.
Right.
So I would love to make it work. I've never been able to do it yet. Do you have anything like that? Do you have a mechanic that's sort of ticking in the back of your head, but you've just not got it on the table yet?
This is going to sound kind of silly. I do sort of the one that got away kind of mechanic. One of the games that always fascinated me endlessly when I was a teenager was Games Workshop's Inquisitor, which is kind of a
you've heard me talk about that with Gav Thorpe and other occasions.
Yeah, it was such a out there game
that transformed my relationship with design.
Yeah, it was such an out there game. It was something. If you were a kid who were primarily into Games Workshop at the time, you had never seen anything like it. No. Even if you weren't, it was kind of out there, And not only that sort of like pseudo RPG stuff, we just say, to hell with balance. Here's a bunch of stuff. Grab things and put them in a game. And then tied to this like very kind of old school feeling, like percentage hit locations and all of that. And that's something I've really wanted to do. Sort of a, kind of mechanically intense, but narrative sort of pseudo RPG combat system like that. But again, it's one of those things where, it's hard to actually execute on that, because if you make it too vague, people are going to throw up their hands and say, we have no idea what to do. We put the big monster and had him fight like 7 dudes with no weapons, and it sucked.
Which was when I first encountered Inquisitor. I had devoured the book and I loved the contents, but I had no idea how to play the game. And it really wasn't until because I was in Bosnia at the time, and it wasn't until I got home and I was able to discover the local community and the Conclave online community that people were sort of able to explain what the game was supposed to do. And at that point, it kind of clicked, and I was like, yes, that comes together. I understand now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a whole different, just a whole different like track to how miniatures games are played and can be played. And I guess it's, if you read old stuff like Laser Burn or something, it has a lot of like similarities to that, and I'm sure it came out.
Well, it's like Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. The original was very narratively focused. I think it's easy. I've just, funnily enough, just done one of my live stream reviews, although I don't think I've downloaded it to go up on YouTube yet. Was of a book called The Haynes Manual of Tabletop Gaming. And I almost picked it up on a whim, because I thought, what am I going to learn from some generic, glossy bookshelf book about tabletop gaming? But when I started reading it, I was really struck by the quality of the content, and I really recommend it to anybody who's interested in it. But one of the things that it touched upon was the emergence of our kind of game. Actually, I'd always thought that our kind of gaming came from role-play gaming. But in fact, it was the other way around. That Dungeons and Dragons grew out of chainmail. The medieval fantasy wargaming system turned into Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
And that early tabletop gaming idea was all narrative. The idea of modern competitive tabletop wargaming simply didn't exist. Everything was assumed that there was a narrative, that there was a story to be told. And so the role-play game naturally evolved from that. And it's our modern tabletop gaming, miniatures wargaming, has drifted away from that pure narrative experience.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. And I think in a lot of ways, it's interesting too, because I think people come to this sort of thing from a lot of different paths. Like there's a lot of ways you can kind of, because the drift from RPGs is such an obvious one, so it makes sense conceptually. Like, oh, of course, this must have been how it, but it's also one of the interesting things I was find is the difference in dichotomy between historical games and like sci-fi games. And I don't know if you do historical gaming at all, but like in sci-fi games, there's a tendency towards the point system, the pick-up game. That's kind of the norm in a lot of cases. Whereas with historicals, while that exists, games like Bolt Action and Flames of War have point systems, but the norm has always been like you create a scenario, like you have a GM who creates a scenario and referees it, or you put it together, even if it's as simple as like, okay, this battalion is going here, you're defending there, and maybe your dude's out of fuel, so they're kind of stuck there, like it doesn't have to be more complicated than that, but it's like there's this assumption up front that, like there has to be a context to what we're doing. It's not just 500 points of Germans versus 500 points of whatever.
Let's say Finnish for the sake of argument.
Post-continuation war.
But isn't it interesting? And this is sort of, it's nice that you touch upon that, because that's really drawing me to where I was thinking next. Because, yes, Flames of War, for example, Bolt Action, for example, I'm trying to think of another one leaps to mind, maybe Black Powder, though possibly to a lesser extent. These are the modern mass market historical games that are built upon the same lines as a game of Warhammer Fantasy. You've got so many points, your opponent's got so many points, you might roll on a table to get a scenario, but otherwise it's supposed to be a balanced confrontation, which of course doesn't happen in reality.
Right.
But at the same time, Flames of War, Bolt Action, and others like them, they make a lot more money than, say, De Bellis Antiquitatis.
Yeah.
There is an obvious commercial imperative to follow what the mass market demands, which is these balanced, relatively context-free wargaming experiences.
Right.
Up to now, as I've said multiple times, you are a prolific rules writer. All of your rules have really been embedded in this idea of the narrative. Are you tempted, now that Nordic Weasel's always had a good rep and good exposure on the indie scene, but maybe hasn't been well known to people. With the Modifius publications, obviously your name is now out there in a much more visible way. Are you tempted to leverage that and write a more mass market, competitive focused game?
I'm going to say no, purely because that's something that conceptually I've wanted to do as a wouldn't it be cool if for a long time. The problem is that unless you have like a whole marketing machine to push that, I think the barrier of entry to doing that is a lot higher because like any gamer's bookshelf is full of competitive oriented army list games that didn't go anywhere, and the only place they live now is your bookshelf. Like hands up, those of you still playing Vor Into the Maelstrom or Void. So yeah, there's two dudes listening to this who put their hands up, and one of them doesn't remember if he actually played or he just saw it at the club.
Yeah, I definitely owned Void. I'm trying to remember if I ever actually played it. It is still technically out there. It is still technically.
Yeah, I think Urban War still kicks around, kind of.
I've lost track of who owns the property now, whether it's still Urban Mammoth or whether it's changed hands again.
Yeah, I mean, Warzone is still technically out there, but I don't know the last time I heard somebody who said they played.
It's interesting in that, actually, this wasn't in my plan, but I'm going to be really interested in your answer. Have you come across Conquest: Last Argument of Kings?
I've heard of it, but I have not read it or played it. No.
But you've seen the game out there.
Yeah.
I'm just interested because obviously Parabellum Wargames and Conquest and their, I can't remember what the skirmish version is called. They are the latest company to really throw a lot of money at trying to create a mass market, miniatures-centric, high-concept, independent game. Now, I have kept predicting their imminent demise for the last 2 years or so.
Right.
And I have consistently been wrong. They are still producing new stuff. They are still releasing new products. And yet, I see very little of it being played, certainly in my immediate sphere. I've heard a few people saying, yes, they're interested, and a few people saying, yes, they bought it, but I'm not seeing it on tabletops. How do you rate their odds of still being here in 24 months' time?
In 24 months, so that's 1.5 COVIDs.
Yeah.
Probably still around. I wonder if they've tapped in because their miniatures are really unique. They have a lot of stuff that looks really wild.
Yeah.
And you can. I mean, if we're being realistic, for every rulebook they sell, they could sell half a box of minis and make the same. So if you have an audience of people who are buying these wild, cool minis to paint up and collect, even if they're not getting that much gaming done, you can still. You're just a minis company now instead of a war games company. And I don't know if that's the case. I mean, but you can definitely
My view is anybody making miniatures is a miniatures company, not a games company, because that's where you make money. So,
absolutely. But I think the contrast to something like Oathmark, which blew up real big, or Kings of War, which was really big for a while. I think that's fading a little bit. I think a lot of it,
they're kind of bumping along Kings of War. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the difference with those two, Kings of War and Oathmark, is while there were stuff you could go buy, they were also relying heavily on stuff that you might already have or own from other companies. So it's much more directly accessible. The problem it's basically the Warhammer Fantasy Battle problem of saying, I need to buy 200 new dudes to play this game.
Yeah.
If I already have some dudes and I can play Oathmark or whatever, that's a much easier sell to get people into. Especially in a case where there were still a lot of people at the time who were kind of adrift, waiting for all my old Warhammer stuff is sitting on a shelf now because I don't like Sigmar or whatever. So there was a ready audience. So yeah, it's interesting because it's not that often we see. I mean, we see it a lot of trying to launch a new game with a new minis line and with the whole thing, and we're going to have novels and books and T-shirts and lunchboxes.
Yeah,
and most of that stuff doesn't really go anywhere because it's just really difficult to. The problem is, I think, that relies a lot. You have to build the community, right? The problem is that it's easy to have a community online, but if you have 3 dudes in Spain and 4 dudes in New Zealand and 2 dudes in Uruguay, they're gonna have a hard time getting together for a game.
Absolutely.
So unless you have I mean, I've never seen Conquest in a gaming store, and again, that could be local.
Well, quite. I'm conscious. I understand it's much bigger in Australia than it has been over here, so I'm prepared to believe that there are people out there throwing this down on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no doubt somebody. You can find 100 people to play anything. The question is, I mean, if they're still around by now, it must be at least breaking even or making a little profit. But like I said, you can make the profit as a minis company even if nobody plays your rules.
That is true.
Like if you go to any place that sell historical minis, like Old Glory or something. I realized
Mm.
just the other day they had a whole page of wargame rules they sold, none of which anyone has heard of, but they sell them. But I guarantee you, the $3 they made on me buying a copy of Trench Wars didn't make a difference compared to somebody buying 200 Prussian Grenadiers or something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think it's to cycle back to the original question about doing like a competitive tournament basy thing.
Yeah.
It's something that I've always, I think, unlike a lot of people in the indie scene, I don't have a conceptual principle against tournament based games. I used to go to 40K tournaments back in 1,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of drifted out of that that mentality, but that's really more like a community thing. I just get exhausted by when people are chasing the meta or whatever, trying to solve the game mathematically.
Yeah.
That just loses my interest. The problem is that it's also an enormous amount of work because as soon as you set up the expectation, this is why everyone who writes beer and pretzel games puts it on the friggin' cover of the book, because that way you get people to stop emailing you saying that the laser rifle is 3 points too expensive. As soon as you have that expectation, you're basically committing yourself to either maintaining it in perpetuity. And I'm already at a point where I struggle doing everything I want to do for things I've already done, because there's always questions or updates or things or tweaks, right?
Yeah.
Or, you condemn yourself to just having a community of belligerent goblins on the internet who are arguing about which units are broken or that the whole game is broken. Or you get...
I'm going to remember a community of belligerent goblins. That's, yeah.
Or it ends up being like War Machine, where, as one fan explained it to me, because since everything is broken, it's fine.
Which is a little bit like Malifaux, actually, in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the Rift's RPG approach to game design. If you just throw everything out there that's wild and crazy, it'll all sort itself out because you can just leave it to the players to figure it out. So yeah, to answer the question, yes, that's something I would like to do, but it's probably not going to happen.
And you make some good points there, which I will ponder. Yeah, the degree of energy and commitment required in sustaining and maintaining a game like that is pretty extraordinary. It is true. It is true.
It is. And you get a situation was it the Guild Ball guys recently who said that they had basically ended up in a corner and there's nowhere else it could go from there. And kudos to them for saying okay, it's done its thing. We're at the end. You know.
I'll be honest, I question the sincerity of that motivation to an extent, but
I mean, they may just have wanted to be done.
That is a topic I will be picking up in a future podcast episode. Is what Guild Ball did next? Because the story becomes yet more interesting. Anyway, we are approaching the end. So first thing before we wrap up is, I mean, what are you working on now? What next? What can we expect, be it from Nordic Weasel or from a partnership with someone else?
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by saying that the world is crazy and we could all be exterminated by meteors tomorrow. So if any of these things don't play out, don't come running to my inbox. So there's some things for certain. Obviously, 5 leagues is going to happen. Text is done. All of the bespoke art is done. So that's making its way through layout and proofing and yada yada. That should be out by the end of the year. The Overlords have committed to, we're going to have lines of probably 40-ish page expansions for both 5 leagues and parsecs.
Yeah, I should say that the first expansion for 5 parsecs was released just a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Which was a big bunch of just ways to hack and tweak your game. More stuff, more things to do. I'm working on the second expansion for that as we speak, and they're pretty committed in. There has been talk of a third title, but I don't think I can say anything about that. With 5 leaks, everyone, like a third of the gaming base was basically predicting it was going to happen. The other third was asking when it was going to happen. And the last third was asking, like, is there a fantasy version? So I don't think it was a surprise to anyone when we announced it, but it was exciting anyway. On my own, there's a couple of overdue projects. The original 5-core skirmish games need an overhaul, particularly because they are so old that I was doing them in like LibreOffice at the time. So while my personal layouts and designs are still a little indie and grungy, I can definitely do better now. And there's been, just stuff that needs catching up. There's a couple of overdue projects. There's a fantasy supplement. I did a series of medieval skirmish rules called Knight, Pike, and Sword, and there's been the audience for that is really small, but extremely vocal in how much they want fantasy. So I need to get that finished. I'll throw out the holy grail of what I want to do, with the caveat that it may not be soon, but it's something I would like to work on probably next year.
You got me excited. I want to hear this.
There's 2 holy grails. One of them is literal because I want to write a Arthurian wargame, but I'm not sure what the format and setup will look like. What I want to do is, because everyone does Dark Ages, because everyone wants to do the like realistic King Arthur. Like I want to do like Mallory like warfare with knights and all
like Excalibur.
Yeah, like have some magic, have some friggin' knights in your
plate armor and caparisoned horses and ladies with their arm in shimmering samite.
Absolutely, and Saxons everywhere. That's what I want to do. So that's a project that's like out there. I'm a big Arthurian nerd.
Yes, you've sold me already.
The second, like I alluded to, is a Great War project. And in my mind's eye, it would be 4 games that would kind of like span all of it. So 2 games on land, 1 platoon level, which I'm actually writing on right now, which will be pretty cool. And then a probably about regimental levels. You have like the skirmish level and more of a battle level. And then, just a shot of all the people who keep asking about it, finally do naval warfare and air, both for World War I.
I wish you good luck. I have been toying with naval warfare on and off for a long time. And every time I start, I think, well, I've got a reasonable design, but this is a very dull game.
Yeah, the problem is that there's a lot of, like, one, the audience is really, like, tech-heavy and, like, gear-heavy.
They really are, yeah.
And 2, like, it kind of is attritional warfare. You read about ships that took, like, 30 hits in a battle, and then they sailed back. So you have to find a way of. So that's a challenge. I've been gathering.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll be interested to see how you tackle that, because I decided that was an idea that had defeated me, and I was not going to touch it with a 10-foot barge pole.
Yeah, I had originally said I just wasn't gonna, because every like naval war game I had read, except for one, was just really dreary to play. Yeah. And the one I like, which is Mongoose's old Victory at Sea, all the grok said it was crap. So it's entirely possible.
Because Warlord have now got their Seas of Blood game, of course, which again leaves all the grognards chewing upon their pipes and spitting out their beer. Because it's just not accurate enough.
Yeah, like I'm one of those people who actually enjoyed Black Powder. I just don't have these 6,000-foot gaming table that they apparently expect.
Yeah.
But I also have enough hubris to suggest that maybe like a fresh look from somebody who's coming from a different background might actually like produce something. But I'm not gonna lie, I'll probably do the airplanes first, because that seems a lot more easily solvable.
Fractionally easier, yeah.
And honestly, a like solo campaign oriented like World War I fighter game sounds friggin' dope.
No, I agree. I think as you said that, I thought a solo narrative fighter game does sound like a winning concept. I like the sound of that one.
Yeah,
that is fantastic. Ivan, before I let you go, is there... I mean, obviously, I should say to my listeners, you can find Nordic Weasel's publications at Wargame Vault. You can find the Modifius versions of Ivan's writing on Wargame Vault, as well as on the Modifius website.
Absolutely.
You've got a Nordic Weasel website. Where's that?
Actually, it is just the blog. I am.
Right.
As I said, I'm crap at marketing. So if you search 5 Minute Normandy at Blogger, that will come right up. I do also have a block space assigned on the Modifius site, which will see more use for parsec specific stuff. And we do have a Discord out there, which I think is linked in at least the 5 Leagues book. So people who are interested can come hang out there. Just
well, if you want to send me a Discord invite, I can stick it into the show notes, and then anybody who sees it can come along and check out the Discord.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really nice community, and it's kind of a broad community because people come from every possible angle to it. So we do enforce our rules pretty strictly to keep the goblins out.
Good stuff. All right, well, thank you ever so much for sharing your thoughts and some inside views into the mind of Ivan Sorensen. I really appreciated your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure.
I'll speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this content, please consider supporting Precinct Omega via Patreon for behind-the-scenes, early access and exclusive extra videos and vlogs, or help keep the show on the road and get great new games from Precinct Omega at Wargame Vault.